Hello and welcome to London Property. I'm your host, Farnaz Fazaipour, and today we're delighted to welcome back Clive Levontine to the show. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Clive actually talked to us originally when the Leasehold Reform was introduced. I think it's going back 4 years now.
At least, yes.
And we've asked him to come back because many of you want to know what to do next. So first I'm going to ask Clive to introduce himself to us and tell us a little bit more about his history and his area of speciality and why he's such a guru of leasehold reform.
Oh, very flattering. I've been a solicitor for 35, 36 years. I'm specialised for a large chunk of that in central London property work with a particular focus on high-value central London residential work and even more focused on issues of leasehold reform, by which we mean enfranchisement, lease extensions, right to manage, and a whole range of other issues around sort of the extracting value from investments in residential property in central London.
And what makes you special is that you do actually act both for landlords and tenants. Some professionals tend to specialise one way or another. So that gives you a real global view as to what each side are trying to achieve, which helps keep people on the straight and narrow, really, doesn't it?
I think that's right. What the advantage of that, as we've always seen it, is, first of all, you're not seen as a landlord man or a tenants man, and that gives you much more scope to take positions when you're negotiating for either side. But much more important than that is, over the years, we're able to advise tenants who are seeking a lease extension or an enfranchisement. What are the things that are really going to drive the landlords? What are they willing to give away? What are they going to insist on? So we don't waste time and money trying to achieve something that's impossible. Likewise, when we're acting for landlords, we know what's important for the tenants and in some cases what they can extract or actually squeeze out of them to get a better deal. So we think acting for both sides has given us quite a unique, not the only one to do it, but fairly unique ability to give balanced and proportionate advice.
So being so deeply involved on both the landlord and tenant side, you know, I know that this has been a process that's been ongoing for 4 years. How closely have you been linked to the processes that goes into making these decisions and making these changes?
In the end, of course, these are political decisions, and I think we'll come back to later how that has influenced the way the legislation has evolved and some of the problems that now exist. But what as a firm we've been involved in, there was initially a Law Commission report and they sought consultation, and subsequently the government on various occasions have gone out for consultation on certain proposals, and we've made a number of representations and observations in those consultations, and we've been able to say we act for both sides. So the representations we're making are not necessarily tenant-focused or landlord-focused. We're focused on, and we've made representations that try to seek a balanced outcome that would actually work both for landlords and tenants.
Right. And I know that when it first came out, you know, there was all sorts of things being promised to change. And I know that, you know, there's controversy around certain aspects of that. So what has actually come through? What do you think is likely to come through? And what do you think looks like we might lose it in the details?
That's the question. So there's an enormous amount of confusion out there, partly caused by government releases, both the outgoing Tory government and the incoming Labour government, about what they're intending to achieve and what they have achieved. There's been a lot of misreporting in the press, very simplified summaries of what the actual new law does and what proposed new laws will do. So where we're at the moment is just before, when the last government called the election very suddenly, what was called the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Bill was at a fairly advanced stage, but they decided in the last couple of weeks of that parliament they wanted to push through some key parts of it, and that became the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act 2024.
Right.
That went through with quite a lot of fanfare about what it will actually achieve. But in fact, as we can talk about in a moment, most of the key provisions that were introduced and are actually there in black and white in print are not yet in force. They haven't been commenced, and there are a number of issues and delays that are going to put back when they are commenced. So, and then separately to that, the new government have come in and said that in addition to the 2024 Act, they're introducing what's called a Leasehold and Commonhold Reform Bill. We haven't got any details of that yet, but they've given some indications of what that's going to include. And again, from the inside, we think that's fraught with difficulties to try and implement some of their proposals in the same way as some of the 24 Act is already proving difficult to implement. So the main changes that are in the 2024 Act, so if you look at the Act, they're in there. The things that really impact on lease extensions, which I think is one of the key things that your listeners want to know about, is the Act says we're going to change the way in which the price for a lease extension is calculated, and we can come back to that in more detail. It allows longer lease extensions, so you used to get 90 years more. You'll now extend to 990 years. It abolishes the old 2-year ownership rule. So when you purchased a flat, you had to wait 2 years before you could extend, or you had to get your seller to serve the notice. That's gone, so that simplifies things. In the old days, you used to have to pay a significant proportion of your landlord's legal and valuation costs, which to some extent, sometimes people felt they were being ripped off by that. When the new law is commenced, you will no longer have to pay the landlord's costs. Each side pay their own. And there's also a separate provision, which means if you've got high ground rents, onerous ground rents, that you can buy those out. You simply pay to buy those out rather than having to extend your lease. So if you had a 200-year lease or something like that, but your problem was the high ground rents, you can buy out the ground rents without necessarily having to pay to extend your lease as well.
Okay, that's helpful.
So it came with a fanfare. It came with this being the panacea to cure all ills for tenants. But in fact, we're a long way from that being the case. So the proposal to change the way the price is calculated is made up really of 3 things. One of which is for leases where there's less than 80 years expired, you used to pay marriage value. The proposal is to abolish marriage value altogether. Secondly, there's always been this historic use of what we call capitalisation and deferment rates. So these are the rates that are used to calculate how much you pay for your landlord's reversion and how much you pay to buy out your ground rents. And the idea now is those rates will be prescribed, possibly changed from time to time. There'll be a panel of experts who will set those. And thirdly, there will be a cap on ground rents for the purpose of calculating your price. So it'll be limited to 0.1% of the capital value. Now, in prime central London, that's not so important. But for example, if you have a flat worth £2 million and your ground rent is more than £2,000 per annum, then the maximum that will be taken into account in calculating your price would be 2,000. This is very important for much smaller, less valuable properties around the country, where you might have a £300,000 flat with a £600 ground rent, but in central London, probably that doesn't make that much difference. Now here comes the problem. The ambition of the legislation was to make lease extensions easier, and the proposals will make the process easier, but also to make it cheaper. Going back to the original objectives, we had the completely impossible how to make it cheaper for tenants while being fair to landlords. And clearly there's a complete mismatch between those 2 objectives. So what has happened, and has always been anticipated to happen, is that even before the government set out exactly how you're going to abolish marriage value and what these prescribed rates are going to be, we know of at least 6 or 7 sizable landlords who own large estates have applied to the court to review the government's legislation, effectively on the grounds that this breaches their human rights, because it's effectively they're appropriating property effectively without paying proper value for it. And there is no doubt that a lot of practitioners in this area, including me, have always anticipated that some of the proposals were liable to be challenged. And it's transpired they have been. And I don't think the government can't say they weren't warned, because they, 2 or 3 years ago, published their own then Queen's Counsel, now King's Counsel's advice, saying that some of their proposals were susceptible to challenge. And a number of other real experts in this area have said they do think this is liable to challenge. And that's caused delays, and it's caused a hiatus because the Labour Party very largely supported what the Tories were implementing. They wanted to go further, but said this is a good start. And we suspect that they came in thinking, well, we will implement all of this. But it's quite clear from their own press releases now that they've taken proper internal legal advice and have been warned that this is susceptible to challenge. And if it was successfully challenged, then they're going to need to go back and change the law, or there's possible claims for damages in the future. So the government needs to be really very careful. So where we are at the moment, so we've got this hiatus. On the face of it, there's some legislation sitting there, but none of it's been commenced. All the old rules continue to apply. And secondly, we don't know what the timing is. So what the government have told us now is they've got to go back and reconsider some of the key issues. And there's lots of conjecture. None of us know what exactly is going to happen, but there is a distinct possibility now that the way in which the government will seek to get around this is to balance landlords and tenants by possibly, and this is only possible, we're all guessing, will it become cheaper for people to obtain lease extensions if they've got leases that are less than 80 years unexpired, or have got currently high ground rents? There's a possibility, we can put it no higher than that in trying to balance up the interests of landlords and tenants, that not only might it not become cheaper for people who have got leases of more than 80 years and have got modest ground rents, it's possible that it certainly won't become cheaper, but it's entirely possible it might become more expensive for those people. So, everything's in the air. No one knows where all the pieces are going to fall. And this creates, I'm sure your next question is going to be, well, given all of that, what should people be doing?
So exactly. I have a lot of people who are asking me, and I have been telling them, wait, I'm going to do an interview on this. So what would be your advice to tenants? Well, I guess to both, but let's start with tenants. So what would be your advice to tenants right now about what to do in this kind of uncertain period? Okay,
so with the caveat that every case is different, so therefore it can't be advice that's appropriate for every leaseholder. So, but broadly speaking, the advice we're giving leaseholders is if you have a lease that's currently got 80, 81, 82 years, then you should almost certainly still be thinking about pursuing your lease extension under the existing rules, because even if marriage value is abolished, then at the moment you don't pay any marriage value, and you've got quite a lot of certainty about the price. So if your lease is getting anywhere near 80 years left, our view is probably to extend. If you need to sell your flat or remortgage, and the length of the lease is an issue for your mortgagee, we know that is the case, then again, life is too short. We don't know whether these changes are going to be 1, 2, 3 years off. Therefore, in that situation, you probably should, in most cases, think about extending your lease now to ensure that you've got effectively the liquidity and the fluidity to be able to sell your flat. If you have currently got quite low ground rents, then that's another reason militating in favour of going for your lease extension now. Things aren't really going to change. If you really have onerous ground rents, then again, there is a case for waiting. If all the other factors don't mean you've got to go quickly, then there's a case for probably waiting, because if you've got very onerous ground rents at the moment, we know one of the objectives is to address the impact of onerous ground rents, and probably it's worth waiting because we think that there's a good possibility that some of the proposals that help leaseholders in relation to onerous ground rents will survive even the reviews that are going on now.
Right. That's a whole other subject, isn't it, ground rents? Because there's all sorts of pension funds that are invested in ground rents. But
there is, and they are some of the people who are challenging at the moment some of the, and it's worth just digressing there for a little bit. So one of the concerns about this legislation and the separate proposals for either the abolition or the control of ground rents, and that's still on that was on the old government's agenda, and they'd already introduced proposals to seek to address it, but that part didn't make the cut when the election was called at short notice. So the new government have adopted a lot of those same proposals, perhaps even want to go further. And we don't know what's going to happen there. And we've got the same issues, is that some ground rents are very onerous. Again, not so much an issue in prime central London. Because if the underlying value of the property is quite high, then having a high ground rent doesn't have the same effect as having a £200,000 flat in a small town out of London paying a much higher ground rent. But where a lot of the so-called perceived unfairness comes in is that a lot of our pension funds have invested in ground rent investments. And the beauty of those ground rent investments was they're a very simple, vanilla envelope investment. So if I've got a building with 100 flats in paying £100 of ground rent a year, even if someone doesn't pay it this year, it's always going to get paid. It's a very, very safe, very simple form of long-term income for 100, 200, 300 years, or however long the leases are. And although they're not very sexy, it means that pension funds say, well, I have this proportion of my investment is in an income-producing asset, which we know absolutely for certain over 10, 50, 100 years is going to produce this. And a lot of those ground rent investors effectively paid a price when they acquired those interests from developers that reflected the value of that long-term ground rents. So the government proposals to either abolish ground rents or to put a very low cap on them would wipe out all or a great majority of the value of those funds, and those funds are in most of our pension funds. So that's one of the groups that are currently lobbying for changes, saying this is unfair. You are effectively artificially taking value away from me, value that I paid fairly 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. I have an asset that's worth £1 million. You're introducing new legislation that would effectively wipe that out or substantially reduce the value of that, and I'm not being adequately compensated for it. And there's a whole range of human rights issues around that as to whether that's fair and what the objectives are and what the policies are. That's probably too detailed.
That's too detailed for this call, but I mean, it actually affecting all those people and their pensions is also a problem, because they've gone into it trusting someone who knows, and then suddenly you can't just take that away. So maybe grandfather those and start again.
That's right. I mean, to be fair, the probably is a very small part of our pensions, but we are talking, I think the figure I heard bandied about was there was something like 30, 40 billion pounds worth of ground rent investment value that is at risk here. So it's sizable. And given post office claims, blood transfusion claims, the last thing the government wants is another massive set of claims on top of that.
They're plenty busy with lots of things that people are not happy with. Okay. And landlords? They want to hope that it doesn't happen.
Well, the landlords is very interesting. As things have evolved over the last, 6 months, a year ago, given the way it looked like it was going, we were advising a lot of our landlords, if you can get your freeholds away to collective enfranchisements or get lease extensions away at or close to the price you would historically have liked to achieve, there's a good case almost in offering people a lease extension or groups of tenants, their freeholds together at a good price, because you're at serious risk of getting a lot less if you leave it. And And gradually over the last 6, 8, 10 months, as the pendulum has changed and the mood has changed, they're less prone to do that at the moment. They're more in the camp of let's sit and wait and see what happens, because it does look as if the pendulum is swinging back. And even if marriage value is abolished and lease extensions are made cheaper for some groups of flat owners, there's a possibility that that will be balanced out by changing the way in which you calculate the price for, say, longer lease extensions, and ensuring that possibly in that situation, landlords, all their value will be preserved. They might even get more than they used to get. So the advice to landlords probably is, if someone's coming to you with, say, a 50-year lease, where there's currently quite a lot of marriage value, but it might be abolished, give careful consideration to trying to negotiate a deal and take what you can. If you've got a portfolio where most of your leases are long leases, much longer leases, particularly if they're at modest ground rents, you may want to just sit and wait. There's not quite the imperative there was 6 months, a year ago, when we were trying to look into the future to try and get rid of much as you could for the best price you could.
So those people who are in the sort of 40, 50-year range, if they don't have to refinance or sell, might be better off waiting as well.
I think that's absolutely. If you're a leaseholder and you've got a lease in that type of 40, 50, 60 years, our advice at the moment would be to wait. But the issue there, of course, if you ever want, people start to panic. Particularly, we know a lot of overseas investors don't like leasehold anyway. They would prefer freehold, even if it's like a share of a freehold with everyone else. And of course, the real issue there is that if you have to remortgage, you know full well that the vast majority of mortgagees are going to say, we want you to have a longer lease, so you have to extend. And clearly, if you want to sell and your buyer is buying with a mortgage, then you almost certainly have to extend your lease beforehand or start the process so that your buyer can stand in your shoes. So, I say, every case needs to be looked at on its own merits. What is driving this? What are the imperatives? How long is your lease? How high are the ground rents? But I think those general rules we talked about are good rules to follow.
So just before thanking you and signing off, I did, when doing one of our news bulletins, come across a news bulletin that said that it's been promised to happen in this government. So that means 28, 29 is when they expect to have the whole thing settled. Would you say that your crystal ball, does it tell us that?
That's a very good question. So there's two sides to this. First of it is the act that's already in force, but not commenced. And before they commence it, they've got to have what secondary legislation, statutory instruments setting out these prescribed rates and working it all out. The government at the moment has gone back to further consultation. And when the government ever talks about consultation, it's a code word for delay. So the consensus view is we're probably 26, 27 for the key parts of the act already in force to be implemented and commenced. Mm-hmm. And there's a whole set of, and then the Leasehold and Commonhold Reform Bill, which is supposed to add on a whole set of further tenant-friendly rules to make enfranchisement easier, to make lease extension easier, to make management rights easier. The view is that we'll be lucky to see those by 28, 29, which will be the end of this Parliament, because they are so complex. There are so many issues that need to be addressed before anything can be really drafted and tabled. So, yes, so from the fanfare in 2023, 2024, this is imminent, we've introduced it, to any of this meaningfully coming into force late this year, next year, possibly 2027, but all the new stuff they're talking about introducing on top, then I suspect we won't see it much before the end of this Parliament. And then, of course, there'll probably be a period once it's passed, again, there'll be a period before it's introduced.
Okay, so the 2-year thing and not paying for the landlord's expenses is actually not implemented yet.
No, it isn't. Some of those things, like the 2-year ownership rule and abolition of paying the landlord's costs, of course, those aren't as contentious. it's possible that some of these simple tinkerings around the outside that don't go direct to valuation, then the 2-year ownership rule is very close. We think the obligation not to pay costs, that we think those may be implemented quite soon.
Okay. So when you say fake news, it was really fake news. We were all like, yay, it's happened.
It hasn't.
It hasn't happened.
It was. I think the Act passed end of May.
Yeah.
And we're now what? So we're now 8-9 months on.
Right. And we had the King's approval and everything.
It's all.
Oh God, okay. Good to know.
So again, it's very messy. Anyone reads a press release, anyone reads the last government's press releases, reads the new government's press releases, read articles in the Times, the Telegraph, all of the broadsheets, Financial Times, they all talk as if there it is, it's done and dusted. And none of them properly reported that none of it is enforced yet.
There you go. And that's why you need to get proper advice.
Indeed.
So any of our listeners who want to navigate this complex part of legislation, you know where to go. So do please get in touch with us, and we'd be delighted to connect you and help you make the right decision, make an informed decision. Thank you so much for coming again, Clive.
Very
and
enjoyable.
we are going to take your time again and talk about the rent bill.
Thank you.
Thank you.